Hello, my name is Jack, and with my group members Jackie and Angelica, we'll be discussing the intersection of gender and race and how it pertains to representations of African American women in film and television. In many ways, women were fundamentally and historically underrepresented in film and television due to motion picture codes. Prior to these codes being enacted, roles for women in film were much more liberal, with films like Babyface, Scarface, and Freaks all coming out in 1932 and featuring a sexually liberated woman who challenged the male gaze. The Hays Codes that were put into effect in 1934 and dissolved in 1968 were enacted by William H. Hays, president of the Motion Picture Producer and Distributors of America, also known as MPPDA. They dictated how certain gender roles, ethnicities, and sensitive subjects were portrayed in media, such as sexual promiscuity, profanity, violence, and idealized gender roles. In terms of motion picture codes and gender roles for women, an already marginalized group became even further restricted in their representation on screen. Character roles were those primarily of maternal nature, confined to the homestead and living in service of the stronger leading male roles, who were presumably the breadwinners of the family. For women of color, there were even less options. The vast majority of roles were being featured from some variation of the mammy character trope, with a larger, older black woman being the caretaker of an affluent white family and living in their service and debt. The alternative was to be an exotic spectacle, a sexual object for the white male gaze, such as the tragic mulatto or the Jezebel roles. Women who were actively sexually promiscuous were often labeled as troubled and were punished in films, resulting in their untimely death or some other form of demise. Strong female roles that broke the traditional nuclear family archetype were usually discouraged and considered to be sometimes outrageous. The 1970s saw a different type of role for women of color with the rise of blaxploitation films such as Foxy Brown coming out in 1974 and starring Pam Grier. They featured strong, defiant women using their sexuality to express dominance over men. These roles broke the submissive mammy trope, but sometimes replaced it with hypersexualized stereotypes. The 1980s and 1990s brought about a new type of role, primarily in the form of television sitcoms and dramas. The sophisticated, nurturing, and family-oriented roles of the matriarch became a commonplace in shows such as The Cosby Show, dating from 1984 to 1992. Claire Huxtable, played by Felicia Rashad, represents an educated, nurturing, and professional black lady, a woman of grace and elegance who cares for her family, provides her fair share of family income, and keeps her husband in check to boot. From the 2000s onward, the representations of gender roles for African American women have been on a steadily upward trajectory. More producers, writers, and actors are in the industry than ever before, enabling roles that are more complex and nuanced. Shows like Abbott Elementary feature a predominantly black female cast, as well as are written and produced by black women, Quinta Brunson and Ava Coleman. This show features a predominantly African American cast with three strong black female leads: Janine Teagues, played by Quinta Brunson, Ava Coleman, played by Janelle James, and Barbara Howard, played by Cheryl Lee Ralph. The gender roles for these women are certainly not those confined to the homestead. They are matriarchal roles, and in a way because they serve as mentors and role models for young children, although they represent their own new category of dominant, successful leadership roles for African American women. This show and the roles represented in it, in regards to this intersection of gender and race, are a massive step in the right direction for unmarginalizing media depictions of women of color. However, they still have certain stereotypes that remain present within them, such as being overly emotional stable or being defensive. A character that is worth mentioning in regards to the intersection of race and gender and representations of African American women in film is Tiana Taylor's rendition of Perfidia Beverly Hills in the film One Battle After Another from 2026. Her character is the antithesis of what is generally stereotyped about women of color in film. She is strong-willed, defiant, and unwilling to conform to the roles of normal motherhood. Perfidia uses her sexuality to gain leverage over the male characters in the film, Sean Penn and Leonardo DiCaprio. Her character is built up as a strong, independent role, always in survival mode, fighting for free bodies, free borders, freedom for all. Then she gets pregnant and doesn't fully understand what this means. Everything changes. Perfidia's role is unique in that it does not belong to a specific character trope. She is complex and unwilling to conform to the rules that society dictates she should follow. Although a strong representation of women of color, her role still alludes to the African American woman as an object of exotic nature, existing for the sake of white male sexual desires, a long ingrained stereotype that harks back to the early tropes created in cinema for attractive young women. In this way, we see that the intersection of race and gender both bolsters her role in the film, yet also marginalizes her due to her use of sexuality and her decisions that she makes.
Hi, I'm Jackie, and I'm going to be talking about representations of African Americans in media. There's a long history of misrepresentation of African Americans, and that's closely tied with a complicated and heartbreaking history that they face in the country. Representations in the media were often reflections of the societal perceptions of African Americans during that time, and there were six archetypes that really stood out to film historian Donald Bogwell. Two of them, the mammy and tragic mulatto, were already touched on by my project partner Jack, but I wanted to touch on the other four prevalent stereotypes. There is a Tom character who's a kind-hearted, submissive black man, also someone who is willing to endure white domination. Then there's the Coon character who's selfish, ignorant, and has no drive in life, often represented as the minstrel type who entertains others. Then there's the Bad Buck character who's violent with pent-up anger. He's physically strong and threatening to whites. Then lastly, there's the buddy slash sidekick character, which is a character that supports the white main character, as to be put in positions where they have to save their white friend. Early representations in the 1900s often would contain racist sentiment about Black people and would contain one of the six previously mentioned archetypes. For example, the 1915 film Birth of a Nation that had the bad buck type of character. The film is about the Civil War, but it paints the KKK as the heroic victors and African American characters as potential rapists, ignorant thieves, and interlopers. Blackface was also a huge theme in the 1930s and 40s, which is the theme of films refusing to cast Black actors. So they would cast white actors in blackface, where they would satirize Black dialect, music, or dances. In the early 1900s, there were also people creating positive images of Black people in film, but those movies were often made by independent producers and were never mainstream. For example, Murder in Harlem, which is a movie directed by Oscar. I don't want to butcher his last name, but I have it on screen, which tells the story of a black man wrongfully accused of murder after he finds a dead white woman while working as a night watchman. There were also race films during this time, which were an attempt at positive representations of POCs. And they're really nuanced because it was a good thing that they were getting the opportunity to be in major films, but they were often light-skinned actors, and the characters would often be one of the stereotypical archetypes that we previously mentioned. In the 50s and through the 70s, there was a variety type of films that were featured that African Americans were featured in. Again, there was a recurring theme of certain Black character stereotypes. For example, the blaxploitation film genre is described as a genre that would depict a super Black or lone hero character who would challenge dominant culture and win. The Shaft trilogy being an example of this. In recent decades, though, there have been a ton more Black people, not only on screen but behind the scenes as well, in prominent roles. And there's been a lot more movies depicting a different and more real aspect of the African American experience that were previously never told.
So my presentation is going to be about the representation of Black women in film and television. Although representation of Black women in media has improved over time, the intersection of race and gender still affects how African American women are portrayed in film and television today. Modern now shows more Black women in leadership roles, professional and complex roles, but many historical stereotypes still remain subtle ways. Even in modern media, older stereotypes still appear in updated forms. The mammy stereotype can still be seen through caretaker or emotional support roles. The sapphire stereotype appears through the angry or emotionally overwhelmed Black woman trope. Tokenism is also present when one woman of color is included in a cast of mainly for diversity without full character development. The tragic mulatto stereotype can also still appear through stories focused on identity, conflict, or isolation. However, there has been major progress in representation. In Abbott Elementary, Black women are portrayed as intelligent educators, mentors, and leaders. In How to Get Away with Murder, Annalise is shown as powerful, successful, and central of the storyline. These portrayals challenge older stereotypes representing Black women as more multidimensional and realistic characters. This connects to socialization theory and cultivation theory, which explains that represented media portrayals influence how audience understand race and gender over time. Critical race theory and Black feminist theory also explain how systems of power continue to shape representation media. Overall, modern film and television reflect both progress and ongoing challenges in how African American women are portrayed in media today.